Scandinavia, a place of haunting natural beauty, a utopian society where beautiful people lead idyllic lives. It's the perfect place for murder. Over the past decade, Scandinavian crime fiction has become a global phenomenon, and the story of its success contains all the ingredients of a thriller. An atmospheric setting where the nights can last for days and there are many lonely places to hide a body.
They're grey, they're gloomy, they're cold. All of these things create the kind of atmosphere where, sort of bad things can happen.
A cast of writers as enigmatic as their fictional creations. The man with many enemies who died before any of his books had even been published. The woman who experienced a murder firsthand.
This was not just a note in the paper. I knew the killer.
A plot that asks whether something has gone wrong with the Scandinavian dream of a perfect society.
It's the light that failed Scandinavian crime fiction. That's the basis of it all. It's the fact that everything goes wrong.
And at its heart is an unsolved murder that traumatized a nation.
A man approached the couple and shot Olof Palme at close range.
The Prime Minister is shot in the middle of Stockholm, right in the center of the city, and it's like 9/11.
From Denmark and Sweden to Norway and Iceland, it's a shadowy world peopled with memorable characters. Kurt Wallander and Martin Beck, Harry Hole and Lisbeth Salander. This is an investigation into the mysterious success of Scandinavian crime fiction and why it exerts such a powerful hold on our imagination. Stockholm, Sweden. It's a capital city with a cool exterior, where citizens enjoy a life of freedom and prosperity, built on the foundations of the post-war welfare state. Clean, safe, orderly, and the setting for a dark and violent thriller that puts Scandinavian crime fiction on the global map.
I started reading it at night, and it was the first Swedish manuscript, definitely in many years. I actually read through the night. I think finishing it at about 4 a.m.
To date, 45 million readers have been gripped by The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, the first part of the Millennium trilogy, a series written by an author who revitalized the crime story with an injection of Hollywood blockbuster thrills. Stieg Larsson.
I think the key to the success of the Stieg Larsson novels is, in a way, very similar to the reason for the success of the Harry Potter novels. Stieg Larsson knew the genre of crime writing inside out. He'd read it for years. He read widely across the genre. What he did was pull aspects of different styles, different writers together to come up with something that ended up being quite different from what anybody else had done.
The success of the series owes much to the mystique that surrounds author Stieg Larsson and his most striking creation, Lisbeth Salander.
He died at 50 without seeing his success, and he created an utterly original heroine.
She had a wasp tattoo about 2 centimeters long on her neck, a tattooed loop around the biceps of her left arm, and another around her left ankle. On those occasions when she had been wearing a tank top, Armansky also saw that she had a dragon tattoo on her left shoulder blade. She was a natural redhead, but she dyed her hair raven black. She looked as though she had just emerged from a week-long orgy with a gang of hard rockers.
To make her utterly sociopathic, to make her this sort of tattooed, bisexual, pierced goth, that was really, a difficult sell.
A gifted computer hacker, Lisbeth Salander teams up with journalist Mankell to expose the ugly secrets that fester behind Sweden's elegant facade, starting with an unsolved murder in a wealthy family with a murky past. As Salander and Blomqvist dig deeper into the Wenger family's affairs, they discover connections to the Swedish Nazi movement.
It was quite clear that the brothers all joined Per Engdahl's fascist movement, the New Sweden. Harold continued to be a member until Engdahl died in the 90s. And for certain periods, he was one of the key contributors to the hibernating Swedish fascist movement.
Just like Mankell, Stieg Larsson was in real life an investigative journalist, but the Nazis he was seeking to expose were part of Sweden's present.
In full uniform, broad daylight, 110 Nazis marched through Stockholm, shouting slogans like "Smash democracy, smash the Jews." Although they are shouting racist abuse, which is illegal, although they are inciting racial hatred, which is also illegal, and although the whole demonstration was actually illegal, the police just let them march.
If Stieg Larsson had died without writing the Millennium trilogy, he would probably be remembered as a very brave investigative journalist. He was the Swedish correspondent for Searchlight magazine in this country, which deals with the far right. And he came to Britain and lectured Scotland Yard on extremist groups. He was quite an interesting figure.
The brazen activities of Sweden's far right in the 1990s prompted Larsson to set up a journal called Nesbø, the inspiration for his fictional Millennium magazine, and still being published in Stockholm today.
Men hade du något mer intressant än den här burkgrejen?
Expo Foundation has a very specific aim to investigate right-wing extremism in all different forms, like organized right-wing extremism, xenophobia, different forms of intolerance.
Larsson's work made him many enemies.
He was working one night at the offices of the magazine he worked on and saw a group of skinheads gathering in the street below with baseball bats who were waiting for him. And he saved his life by getting out through another exit.
Like the old gunfighters in the West, he would sit with his back to the wall and his face to the front of coffee shops which he frequented.
A life lived on the edge took its toll on Stieg Larsson's health.
Yeah, he smoked all the time when I met him. You could see that he didn't look healthy. He was fat, or corpulent, if you say. He looked tired, but he had an energy about him.
That energy was the product of a desire to fight injustice that Larsson had nurtured since his youth.
Gradually, his political interest became more focused on fighting what he felt as the basic evils of the world, which to his mind were fascism in all forms, but more basically racism or sexism or the very idea that other people are inferior because of some chance of their birth.
Larsson used journalism to shine a light on prejudice in Sweden, and he set out to dramatize the issue in his novels through the character of Lisbeth Salander, a volatile rebel on the margins of society.
She's ferociously bright. She understands things that you almost wonder how she understands them, because in some respects her empathy is non-existent. She has a very distinctive way of viewing the world, but she doesn't fit into the world.
In the only interview he ever gave about his books, Larsson revealed the unlikely source of inspiration for Lisbeth Salander, a children's book by Swedish author Astrid Lindgren.
It was an old idea from actually from the first half of the 90s. So I picked up Pippi Longstocking, 8 years old. What would happen to her? A sociopath? Wrong, he said. She has another different take on society from the rest of us. I'll do it 25 years old. She has this outsider perspective, or she has this outsider situation. Doesn't know anybody. He has no skill whatsoever when it comes to social competence. That was the idea from the beginning, he says.
An outsider with a troubled upbringing, Selander is abused and eventually raped by her legal guardian, portrayed in the film of the book by Petter Anderson, an actor who plays the role with a cold menace that emphasizes his perversion of the father-daughter relationship.
Så förstå mig rätt, Lisbeth, jag ger dig gärna 20 000, det är inte det alltså. Jag vet att en affärstransaktion bygger på förtroende. Jag måste ju känna att jag kan lita på det. Kan det gå man?
The abuse of women is a constant theme in a novel punctuated with statistics about domestic violence, an issue Larsson even raised in the original Swedish title of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo.
Oh, this is the first one. Män som hatar kvinnor. Men who hates women. It's the title. I think it's a good front page of a book, since it was a magazine and it looks like a magazine. Very smart.
He initially intended this to be the overall title for his entire series of 10 novels, because they all are about men who hate women. And he would have been aghast that this title has been changed in so many languages, because he felt this was important.
Lisbeth Salander might be a victim of the men who hate women, but she's also Larsson's avenging angel.
So you've got this sort of messed up woman who's been sexually abused, who's been damaged profoundly by the things that have happened in her life, but has somehow managed to cling on to the kind of humanity that can move her forward. She's ruthless, and you would have to say some of the routes by which she takes her revenge are appalling. But at the same time, you find yourself, behind her all the way. You want her to succeed.
In this scene, the perspective of victim and abuser is reversed as the director uses unsettling camera angles to put us in the position of Lisbeth's guardian, now at the mercy of his charge and her tattoo needle.
Is Stieg Larsson a feminist? That's the $64,000 question. Some women writers have said to me, those are gloatingly exploitative books in which all the sexual violence is there for us to enjoy, and then we're given this rider to say, but it's okay, she gets her own back. They feel that doesn't buy Stieg Larsson a ticket out of that.
There are people who believe that she is a psychopath, an antisocial personage who should be maybe put away, and that if people actually acted this way, it would be disastrous. We did have the same discussion in Sweden 50, 60 years ago when the Pippi Longstocking novels were published.
Lisbeth Salander might be a violent sociopath, but she has much in common with the strong-willed heroine of a Danish novel by Peter Høeg that first introduced Scandinavian crime fiction to a wider audience.
I'm not perfect. I think more highly of snow and ice than of love. It's easier for me to be interested in mathematics than to have affection for my fellow human beings. But I am anchored to something in life that is constant.
You could say that the two most significant Scandinavian novels are both published by Christopher Mankell. He published Miss Spiller back then, he published The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. And the heroines of both They don't belong to any one society. They can't quite function in any one society because they've got tugs from the different parts of their past and the way they were brought up and the things that have happened to them in their lives.
Published in 1992, Høeg's novel follows Smille's mission to prove that the death of Isaiah, a young Greenlandic boy she's befriended, was no accident.
Now, Smille is very much known for, as the title suggests, her knowledge of snow or her feeling for snow. At one point, she is a researcher doing research into snow and crystals. And she, of course, has a past in Greenland where knowing snow conditions can be a matter of life and death. Now, at the outset of this crime novel, the little boy Isaiah is found dead after a leap from the roof of the apartment block. Smille Jespersen finds that this is not an accident. She can read the footsteps in the snow, and these footsteps suggest that he has been chased off the roof and has fallen to his death.
An award-winning literary novelist, Høeg's precise descriptions of winter landscapes set a benchmark in Scandinavian fiction.
It is freezing, an extraordinary -18 degrees, and it's snowing, and in the language which is no longer mine, the snow is granic, big, almost weightless crystals falling in stacks and covering the ground with a layer of pulverized white frost. December darkness rises up from the grave, seeming as limitless as the sky above us.
It's a beautifully written book. It's a book of great colour, great atmosphere, with a great sense of place. What's so clever about it is the fact that it's kind of disquisition on language about the different nuances of snow, of different kinds of snow, which we don't have in Britain. But that's also the key to the mystery.
Smille's journey ends in the frozen wastes of Greenland. A bleak backdrop typical of the Scandinavian crime novel.
I think a lot of Scandinavian landscapes are imposing, they're impressive, that they make you feel like a small person in a big landscape. They're grey, they're gloomy, they're cold. All of these things create the kind of atmosphere where, sort of bad, difficult things can happen. And I think a lot of the Scandinavian writers use this to sort of great effect.
The climate reflects, of course, the minds of the people. I had an English friend, he had a woman in Finland and he spent 10 years in Finland, and the woman left him after the first year and he said, "I'm getting so depressed, Håkan, what's wrong?" And I said, "The wrong thing is that you're in Finland." And then he eventually went back to London and he was fine in 2 weeks. So I mean, it's you need to be from the Nordic countries to stay alive happily here, I think.
Of all the landscapes that might challenge humankind's instinct for survival, few are bleaker than Iceland, home to the brooding, weather-obsessed crime novels of Arnaldur Indridason.
Indridason, he writes for people who recognize the locales, who understand the terrors and dangers of the wilderness of Iceland. It is a place where people can disappear.
It was still raining. The low-pressure fronts that moved in from deep in the Atlantic at that time of year headed east across Iceland in succession, bringing wind, wet, and dark winter gloom.
Little wonder that Indridason's main character, Detective Erlander, is so depressed.
And it is the long, dark nights which in those books becomes a long, dark night of the soul, usually for the detective, who is usually going through a bad time. There are very few detectives who have really good, happy personal lives, certainly in Scandinavian crime fiction.
Erlender's cheerless personal life is portrayed with a hint of pitch-black humour by director Balthazar Kormaker in the film Jar City, with actor Ingvar Eggert Sigurdsson delivering a bone-dry performance as he tucks into an Icelandic delicacy of sheep's head while babysitting his junkie daughter.
Heyr ó raust mína ég kveina. Varðveit líf mitt fyrir ógnum óvinarins. Skýl mér fyrir bandalagi bófana, fyrir óaldarflokki illvirkjana. Leggja örvar sínar beiskirðin á streng, til þess að skjóta í leyni á hinn ráðvanda.
When you read a writer like Arnaldur Indriðason from Iceland, you know, those books are really quite dark and grim and difficult, and then but they're shot through with these sort of really dark and awful bits of humour. People laugh at the worst sort of things, but that also reflects a kind of reality. You know, when life is grim and dark, people find something to laugh at.
Laughs are at a premium in Jar City, a macabre story about missing organs and genetic manipulation inspired by a controversial real-life plan to create a DNA database of every Icelander.
Jar City is one of the very best modern Scandinavian crime novels and one of the best modern crime novels. It's interesting that that's a book which is driven by hatred and fear of the surveillance society. It's based on a true life case of the availability of genetic material to one company. The Jar City of the title is human organs in jars. It's a horrific novel.
And you keep all these secrets, old family secrets, tragedies, sorrows and death, all carefully classified in computers. Family stories and stories of individuals. Stories about me and you. You keep the whole secret and can call it up whenever you want. A Jar City for the whole nation.
Dark secrets, bleak landscapes, grim weather, and famously long winter nights. It's a world where the first chink of light comes as a blessed relief.
The longing for the summer, the longing for the returning of the light is, of course, a pagan tradition, but something that is deeply ingrained in all Scandinavians.
Midsummer in Sweden. If you'd been here in the 60s, you could be forgiven for thinking you were in paradise.
Anyone in this permissive society can buy contraceptives in the street or pornographic magazines.
A liberal utopia of free love and welfare for all. Or was it?
I came to London the first time in 66 and 67. 67 was the flower power summer, and then they said, "Oh, you're from Sweden, the country of free love." What? And I was 17 and I had no experience of any free love in Sweden whatsoever. So that was definitely a myth. We made one or two films with some naked bodies and that was it. But we were never the country of free love, I can tell you.
There was even a feeling in some quarters that the fabled welfare state, designed to use Sweden's post-war prosperity to fund healthcare and benefits, had failed to live up to expectations. That sense of disillusionment prompted two left-wing reporters, Maj Sjöwall and Per Valu, to begin work on a series of 10 crime novels that pioneered the idea of using detective fiction to analyse the state of the nation, the template for Scandinavian crime fiction.
They began it all. They began it all in the sense of taking the kind of police procedural of Ed McBain, putting it down in modern Scandinavia. They also added this social dimension. They gave it a Marxist perspective, and that's unfashionable now. But that political perspective is what's lived on from their work.
Vi träffades först därför att vi arbetade på varsin veckotidning på samma förlag. och blev goda vänner och sen blev vi kära i varandra. Och under den här perioden från vän till kärlek så pratade vi väldigt mycket med varandra om allt möjligt. Och det var då vi fick den här idén, för vi pratade om kriminallitteratur som vi tyckte om och läste. Men då kom vi på att i Sverige fanns det inga realistiska polisromaner som beskrev polisarbete. Och då sa vi, ska vi försöka.
In 1965, Sjöwall and Wahlöö began to write crime stories about a unit of the Stockholm police led by Inspector Martin Beck, stories with a hidden agenda they called the Project.
Det projektet var ju det att vi började prata om det här med realistiska polisromaner där man kunde involvera ett politiskt sätt att se på samhället från vänsterkanten.
For the fact of the matter is that the so-called welfare state abounds with sick, poor and lonely people living at best on dog food, who are left uncared for until they waste away and die in their rat-hole tenements.
Their novels are both subtitles, a story of a crime, the crime of the social democrats leaving the working class behind. The welfare state doesn't seem to live up to its socialist ideals from the left perspective.
And maybe that's what all Scandinavian crime fiction is about, the death of the dreamer. It's the light that failed Scandinavian crime fiction. That's the basis of it all. It's the fact that everything goes wrong.
It was quite surprising reading those books because the image of Sweden that I think we had in this country was that it was this kind of almost socialist paradise, and that although their taxes were high, they'd actually found this marvellous golden mean where everything was lovely. And then you read the Martin Beck novels and you think, wait a minute, this is quite a different picture we're seeing here.
The overtly political subtext of the books marked a radical first in Swedish crime fiction, and Martin Beck became the prototype for the classic Scandinavian detective.
Martin Beck sat on the green bench in the subway car and looked out through the rain-blurred window. He thought about his marriage apathetically, but when he realised that he was sitting there feeling sorry for himself, he took his newspaper out of his trench coat pocket and tried to concentrate on the editorial page. He disliked the subway, but since he cared even less for bumper-to-bumper traffic, and that dream apartment in the centre of the city was still only a dream, he had no choice at the moment.
Beck is very much a human character. He's flawed. He has a difficult relationship with his wife, with his family. Some of his relationships with his colleagues are difficult. He's kind of dyspeptic and gloomy, and he's not in any sense heroic. But he's a man who thinks about the world. He thinks about his place in the world, and he thinks very carefully about his job. He's thoughtful, and he's compassionate.
I think he's very modern. He's rather cool in the sense of being, you're never quite sure what he's thinking at any given time, slightly existential approach to the problems around him, and completely in touch with what's happening in society. He's conscious he knows his society inside out, which not every copper does.
It was realistic, it was not romantic, it was a hard-working police officer, easy to like, not very happy, not very lucky with women. I believed in him. You can't believe in Agatha Christie the same way.
The realism of the novels was considered shocking for the time.
Men det fanns ju, det hörde jag bokhandlare säga, att det fanns små damer som läste Agatha Christie och så. Och de blev mycket besvikna och upprörda för att det var för realistiskt. Redan i Rosanna på 5:e sidan skriver en naken kvinna. Det fick man inte göra. Och privatliv hos polisen fick man heller inte blanda in i deckargåtor. Det var ju sådana här pusseldeckare på den tiden.
Looking back more than 40 years later, Sjöwall still fondly recalls the long night she spent with Per Valu putting the world to rights.
Och sen fick var och en ansvara för det kapitel som den skrev. Och så satt vi på natten mitt emot varann med papper och penna och skrev. När det var tyst och barnen sov. Och rökte kopiöst och drack kopiöst mycket te. Jag kommer ihåg man kunde bli tokig när man själv inte kom igång. Och Pelle satt och skrev. Och så satt han och flina lite. Jävlar, han skrev något roligt också. Så att, ja, det var väldigt, väldigt kul och stimulerande att jobba på det sättet.
Per Valu died in 1975, just as the final book in the series was published. The Terrorists would be his epitaph, and its plot, about a political assassination in Stockholm, would prove eerily prophetic.
Shocked Stockholmers who heard the news of the tragedy on the radio hurried to the scene of the crime.
As he and his wife Lisbeth walked home from the cinema entirely on their own, the murderer simply walked up to the Prime Minister and shot him twice in the stomach.
Olof Palme had taken an evening off to go to the cinema with his wife. A couple of hundred yards from the cinema, a man approached the couple and shot Olof Palme at close range. Mr. Palme collapsed in a pool of blood.
The killing of Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme on February the 28th, 1986, sent shockwaves across Scandinavia.
Well, they used to say that we lost our innocence when Olof Palme was shot, and of course, in a way, it's true because the Prime Minister is shot in the middle of Stockholm, right in the center of the city, and it's like 9/11. You know where you were, you know how you heard the news the first time, and we were in a shock after that.
Swedes perceive the state as a benevolent entity, which is their hope and their father figure in a sense. And obviously the Prime Minister then symbolizes the state, regardless of which party he happens to come from. So killing the Prime Minister was an attack on the benevolent mainstay of society.
Despite a lengthy manhunt and countless conspiracy theories, the murder of Olof Palme has never been solved.
The inability of the police to solve the murder has become a wound that cannot heal in Sweden, and something most crime writers more or less explicitly returns to. It was the end of the dream of this harmonious, happy, just, controlled society.
It's a mystery that continues to cast a shadow over Swedish society.
There was a sense that these things, these kind of arbitrary, brutal political assassinations, couldn't happen in Sweden. And Swedes suddenly had to realize that the world was a dangerous place. It was kind of the scales falling from the eyes. It was that kind of a moment. But it led to all kinds of reassessments of that kind of social democratic ideal. How intact was it? It made Swedes realize that they were kind of like the rest of the world. And then it seemed that all the other troubles of the rest of the world flooded in.
With borders crumbling after the collapse of communism and membership of the EU ratified in 1994, a new wave of migrants sought refuge and opportunity in countries like Sweden, creating tensions in what had once been homogeneous societies.
There was in Scandinavia, from the beginning of the 80s, a growing sense of insecurity towards the outside world, what will become of our countries with the pressures of globalization and neoliberalism.
Those anxieties are at the heart of a series of acclaimed crime stories set in the small port of Ystad and written by an author who had grown up with the radical politics of Sjöwall and Valu, but now found a country struggling to open up to the world. Henning Mankell.
It was 1988, and I realized that the problem with xenophobia and racism was growing heavily and very fast in Sweden. And I decided that I wanted to write about that. And since these kinds of expressions, xenophobic reactions to certain things, is to me a criminal gesture, I decided to use the crime plot to write about that. I wanted to try to describe how difficult it is to be a good police officer.
Mankell's creation, an angst-ridden detective in the Martin Beck mould, would go on to become a TV staple, the definitive Scandinavian detective, Inspector Kurt Wallander.
Maybe the times require another kind of policeman, he thought. Policemen who aren't distressed when they're forced to go into a human slaughterhouse in the Swedish countryside early on a January morning. Policemen who don't suffer from my uncertainty and anguish.
Conveying Wallander's inner turmoil on screen presents the kind of challenge that actors relish. Kenneth Branagh plays him with theatrical intensity, but it takes a Swede like Christer Henriksson to channel the melancholy spirit of Ingmar Bergman, as we see in a scene where opera music is used to emphasize Wallander's solitude in the Swedish TV version.
I mean, the Swedish prototype for a detective is that he's Wallander is even you're tired, you're depressed, you are almost suicidal. But that's also the Ingmar Bergman type. I mean, we're not supposed to talk like I do. We're supposed to just sit there and stare blankly out into the whatever darkness. That's the picture you have of a Swede, isn't it?
Och då, när jag läste Hennings böcker tänkte jag, men varför har inte någon frågat mig om det här tidigare? Jag vet ju precis vem den här karaktären är. Det är jag. Och också, det påminner ju också det här, hans yrke, det här med att han är polis. Och han är ju en slags artist i sitt yrke. Alltså han går ju väldigt mycket på någon slags intuition.
Wallander's gift for police work has come at a price, something the Swedish TV series explores through his awkward relationship with his daughter Linda, a junior police officer.
För han vet också då vad det här polisyrket har krävt av honom och framförallt också vem det har gjort honom till med ensamheten, med spriten, med alltihopa. Och han blir väldigt rädd att Linda ska behöva genomgå samma saker.
The off-screen dynamic between actors Christer Henriksson and Johannes Sällström brings an intimate realism to this scene about Linda's decision to become a cop.
Men jag har ju inga barn.
Nej, men en vacker dag så får du väl det. Och då kommer de ligga och snurra runt där i sängen.
Man kan sluta som polis.
Nej, inte om man är en bra polis. För då låter man sig långsamt mala sönder och brytas ner. Utan att göra någonting åt det.
Varför?
Därför att man är så uppslukad av sin uppgift i början att man inte märker att man förlorar både fru och barn.
Man kan ju säga den relation som Johanna Sällström och jag hade när vi filmade varandra, den finns med i filmen. För så komplicerat var vår relation också. Den var full av kärlek. Men också gentemot mig så var det där att hon såg mig som en gammal skådespelare som trodde att han visste allting.
Henriksson brings an air of world-weary disenchantment to a character weighed down by the horrors he's witnessed.
Christer Henriksson's performances are very subtle and understated, and we study him very intensely when we know he's had a particularly bad emotional experience. It's not going to be on the surface. We have to read it in the crinkle of an eye.
In this scene, from an episode called The Container, we see Wallander's reaction of mute shock when he arrives at the final resting place of a group of refugees who died on their way into the country. All the evils of the world wash up on the shores of Ystad in Mankell's novels and the 26 stories he created specially for Swedish TV.
Det är ju det att det innehåller ju alla slags ämnen som du läser om i dagstidningar. Alltså immigration, asyl, knark, ekonomisk brottslighet, alltihopa det här som Sverige är ganska genomsyrat av.
The problem with immigration, that's now a kind of sore point. Swedes prided themselves on their liberalism, but they had to admit finally that it was a problem for them the way it's the problem for the rest of the world.
What we're watching now, according to Henning Mankell, for instance, is that it's Sweden's fall from grace, isn't it? There must be something rotten in the state of Sweden.
Mankell's bid to explore national anxieties through the prism of murder in a small town has taken its toll on the fictional citizens of Ystad.
In Mankell's novels, there have been, I suppose, a couple of hundred murders in the last 20 years or so, whereas in reality, I can't think of a single one.
Don't go to Ystad, you'll get killed before tomorrow. So yeah, no, that's where realism ends.
Ystad might be a town under siege from external forces, but further west, among Norway's mountains and fjords, it's the evil within tiny communities that fascinates poet-turned-crime writer Karin Fossum.
The village lay in the bottom of a valley, at the end of a fjord, at the foot of a mountain, like a pool in a river where the water was much too still, and everyone knows that only running water is fresh.
Well, I live in a small community myself. It's a small village, it's a church, it's a school, it's a lake, it's a mountain. If someone gets killed, I will probably know either the person itself or some of the family or the relatives.
The pressures that can build up in a small community are at the heart of novels steeped in the psychological intensity of Norway's national playwright Henrik Ibsen.
Ibsen is one of the great purveyors of this kind of thinking, that social situations, the social environment can create social outcasts who may act irrationally and, in Karin Fossum's novels, violently.
Karin Fossum is a very interesting writer because she understands, if you like, the relationship between killer and victim. She understands that these things generally don't happen in an accidental kind of way, that there are connections, there are reasons. And I think she writes with great compassion for both sides of the equation, if you like, for the person who finds himself killing and the person who ends up being killed.
Fossum brings a poet's sensitivity to stories that deal with emotion rather than mystery.
Many crime stories, they start with a picture of the dead body. If you don't know this dead body, you won't be moved by the story. You won't feel anything. And my passion as a writer, sometimes even my problem as a writer, is that I'm trying to make you feel something. I want to move you. I'm not trying to be clever or to make clever plots. I don't care too much about the plot. It's not important to me. But I would like to move you emotionally.
Karin Fossum's empathy for both killer and victim is rooted in her personal experience of a traumatic crime.
Someone I knew very well committed a murder. It's many years ago. I had known this person for 18 years. And suddenly this was not just a note in the paper. I knew the killer, I knew the victim was a child. I knew the flat. I had been there many times. I knew the exact, the specific room. And I thought, but this is a good person. It can't be. It was a very, very strong experience for a writer. And suddenly I understood this can happen to everyone. It could have been my father, it could have been my brother. And every time I read about a murderer, I think he has a mother, he has a brother, he has children. And up till this date, he was a good guy.
Why did you hit her? Why? I was holding the dumbbell in my hand. She was curled up with her hands over her head, waiting for the blow. Couldn't you have turned around and left? No. I need to know why. Because I'd reached a boiling point. I could hardly breathe. Could you breathe again after she collapsed? Yes. I could breathe again.
I'm writing about death. Not murder, not killings, not psychopaths, but death itself and how it affects us.
The remote communities in Karin Fossum's books are in sharp contrast to the bustling cities that flaunt Norway's status as one of the world's wealthiest nations. The discovery of oil in the 1970s transformed the fortunes of a country of just 4 million people, and it continues to shape the Norway of today, as chronicled in the thrillers of Nesbø.
After the Second World War, Norway was a poor country. I mean, if you go back to the 20s, Norway was actually one of the poorest countries in Europe, together with Portugal, Northern Ireland and Greece. But in the 70s, the Norwegians, or actually the Americans, found oil outside the Norwegian west coast. And suddenly overnight, Norway had become this very rich country. And yes, I think it certainly changed the soul of the country.
In Nesbø's world, the battle for Norway's soul has left a moral vacuum filled with crooked cops and serial killers.
You would think that more money would give us more space and better opportunities to feel solidarity with the rest of the world. But actually it seems like it's the other way around, that money has to some degree corrupted us.
The afternoon sun angled across the town and came to rest in Bjørvika, an area of Oslo containing a motorway, a deposit for shipping containers, and a refuge for junkies. But it was soon to have an opera house, hotels, and millionaires' apartments. Wealth was beginning to take the whole city by storm. It made Harry think of the catfish in the rivers in Africa, the large black fish that didn't have the sense to swim into deeper waters when the drought came, and in the end were trapped in one of the muddy pools that slowly dried up.
Nesbø gave up lucrative careers as a stockbroker and member of one of Norway's most famous rock bands to write crime fiction. His protagonist is Detective Harry Hole, a Norwegian take on the maverick American style of cop.
It's clear that Nesbø has read Raymond Chandler, and Harry Hole may be in Scandinavia, but there's an American hard-boiled, sardonic quality to him. The fact that he's a loner, essentially, and he's not particularly good at relating to people.
So I think that may be something in the Norwegian way of thinking and our culture. We don't want to be part of big things. We want to have our own, farm, our own small fishing boat, and getting by doing our own thing.
In Nesbø's dark thrillers, Harry Hole is driven by the desire to understand the killers he's hunting.
Harry has been fascinated with evil for a long time, and I think that has, of course, to do with the writer's fascination with evil. I think for me it started when I was a young boy. I can remember in the classroom there was a guy who was sitting on the window row, and he would catch flies in the windowsill, and then he would start picking, using a tweezer to pick off one leg and then the wings, you know. And of course this is not unusual, but what fascinated me was the tweezer. It was the idea of this boy being at home and sort of planning what he would do when he would get to the classroom. But anyway, the fascination for what goes on in the human mind probably started there and then.
But he's very much in a Hollywood tradition, and that sets him apart and also makes him interesting in a Scandinavian context, because he still writes from within a, let's say, Norwegian cultural context.
For Nesbø, even the innocent snowman becomes the stuff of nightmares.
It's a woman who's coming home late in the evening, and she will come into the kitchen where her husband and son is making dinner for her, and she will say, how nice, you're making dinner for me, and what a nice snowman you built in the garden. And they sort of stop and they look up at her and say that we haven't built the snowman. And so they will go into the living room and look at this big snowman standing in the garden. It's too big and it's too close to the house, and it's turned the wrong way because it's looking directly into the living room. It's looking at them. And that was sort of, you know, I didn't know how this scene would connect to the rest of the story, but I knew that was a starting point for a story.
Cordon off the whole area, Harry said. His throat felt dry, rough. I'm calling in the troops. What's happened? There's a snowman here. So? Harry explained. I didn't catch the last bit, Holmes shouted. Poor coverage. The head, Harry repeated. It belongs to Sylvia Otterson.
Nesbø is part of another trend in Scandinavian crime fiction that does turn for the more bloody. Where do you go in Scandinavian crime fiction after you have torn apart the welfare system? You have asked all the questions about why are people so violent, what is happening to our societies. Where do you go after that? And one of the answers in more recent Scandinavian crime is you go into more blood and more violence.
Jo Nesbø isn't the first Norwegian to use gruesome imagery in his work. This is the country that produced an extreme genre of satanic rock music known as black metal, once Norway's most gory and violent export.
They didn't only talk about, being anti-Christ. They actually burnt churches. I think that people throughout the world, they were really impressed with that. I can remember going to Mexico many years ago, and I went to this punk market, and you would have stands there selling Norwegian black metal, and they would have, written on the cassettes and see this guaranteed Norwegian.
Jo Nesbø is just one of many writers carrying the hopes of publishers eager to replicate the multi-million selling success that began in Europe with Henning Mankell and reached the world with Stieg Larsson.
It's something that has to do with marketing. I mean, we were successful in Germany and we had a few good writers, and these books are selling, Stieg Larsson's for instance, enormously well, but it will pass. We used to have good tennis players too some years ago.
Stieg Larsson might have done for Scandinavian crime what Björn Borg did for tennis, but he was destined never to enjoy the fruits of his success. He died in 2004, not in a right-wing plot, but on his way to work.
It's the case of the journalist who doesn't look after his body. Hold the front page. It's a man who lives on junk food, who who smokes prodigiously, has a phenomenal nicotine intake, an awful lot of coffee, which of course is something reflected in the book. If he died at the hands of the far right, it would have been with baseball bats outside his office. It wasn't. He died because he came to the office, the lift was broken, he had to go up 6 flights of stairs, and his body finally gave out. It's that prosaic.
The whole situation is extremely sad. I mean, Stieg lived to be 50 years old and a couple of months, and basically never in his life had any money. Not that he ever wanted any money, but he would have liked to have had a fair amount of money so that he could maybe hire 1 or 2 more people at Expo and so do more of his own writing. And that's about what he was hoping for when he sold his novels. He never saw anything of the, by now, hundreds of millions involved in the Millennium franchise.
Larsson did bequeath the world one final mystery.
There is the mystery of the 4th book, what exists of it. It changes on a daily basis. It's like the plot of a Stieg Larsson novel. Recently, an email has come to light which seems to suggest that 2/3 of it were written, which wasn't what we heard before. A beginning was written, an end was written. It needs to have something done in the middle. It has a Canadian setting, a bleak Canadian setting. I personally can't see the value of it being completed by anyone, because there's such a sense of the 3 Millennium books being this perfect entity.
Larsson's heroes aren't the only ones whose adventures appear to have come to an end. Even Wallander is about to hang up his badge, and Henning Mankell felt unable to continue a planned series about Linda Wallander following the suicide of Johanna Sällström, the actress whose charisma lit up the screen and the set of the Swedish TV series.
Hon hade ju det där otroligt, alltså hon hade ju den här otroliga sårbarheten. Hon hade också det där trotset. Allt fanns med. Hon var min dotter.
Much-loved characters might have reached the final chapter, but the kind of fictional heroes who follow in their footsteps will be determined as much by Scandinavia's future as its past.
What will come, what kind of crime fiction will be popular in the future, it's hard to say, but I think the sort of Wallander type of crime novels will still have a place and inspiration for new crime writers. What we see in the younger generation is that, yes, they are still reflecting on particular landscapes, particular social situations. They are not so much engaged in the directions of their own societies. They are much more interested in finding out what happens in a globalized world.
There might not be many happy endings, but in societies that tend to crave order, there'll always be someone willing to stare out into the darkness and make sense of a turbulent and ever-changing world.
There is a sense that right is done at the end of most Scandinavian crime novels, but it's never in a kind of resounding way. There's always a sense that there is someone out there, if he may have put down one particularly nasty piece of work or one piece of corruption, but out there are people trafficking gangs, out there are sexual abusers. But at least for the duration of that one novel, justice has been seen to be done. Maybe imperfectly, but it's been done.
You can find out more about Krista Henriksen's experience of playing Wallander at bbc.co.uk/timeshift. And coming up next here on BBC4, stay with us to see the Nordic Noir in action with part 2 of Wallander. Wow, it's almost like we planned it. And then next Monday at 9:30, we're back with Timeshift for Italian Noir.